by Tony, and I'm the Vice President of Equity and Community Inclusion at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I want to start by welcoming Regg Cohn from the TMU Democracy Forum, and thank you so much for the invitation. I love these talks. I find them gripping. I find Martin never shies away from a difficult question. They're meaningful, and I think they're important in a time where we need to think about these ideas, debate these ideas, and learn from folks that are doing the frontline work. Martin will be doing a formal introduction of Minister Gary Anandasangaree. And as a fellow human rights lawyer, I just want to say it's been an honor to connect with you, and we're very pleased to have you and welcome you here. We always start at Toronto Metropolitan with a land acknowledgement. What I want to say before I say the land acknowledgement is, at times we think when we say land acknowledgement that we might be acknowledging the land. And the Indigenous community has taught me here that when they acknowledge the land, they're acknowledging the actual land, the trees, the water, the salmon that feeds us, the trees that nourish us and give us air, right? When we're acknowledging the land as settlers, what we're actually acknowledging is the people and the caretakers of this land. And so here we say that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. It's a treaty, the dish with one spoon, and it's a territory that signifies that the people that were caretakers here are the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and that all newcomers that have come into this territory, including Europeans, are welcome into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Chimigwech. We want to say also that at TMU, when we think about democracy, one of the things we really focus on is to go beyond just voting and the elections and what it means to actually engage in democratic conversation. We're dedicated to empowering our citizens to address some of the most pressing and difficult issues, ones that I wrestle with and I think will come up today. And the Democracy Forum, supported by the Dais, is Canada's platform for some of the boldest policies and better leaders. So free and public events like these try to engage leaders in dialogue about critical issues that are facing our society. They serve to strengthen our democracy, but my hope is that we actually have meaningful and difficult dialogue. I think increasingly that dialogue that's difficult, we need to train and equip the people that are in our community to hear and hold multiple truths, and also to be able to disagree and still lead with relationships that aren't ruptured completely. So I want to introduce Martin and thank Martin, Kareem, and the entire Dais team for the inspiring work to promote these democratic ideals. Martin's a political communist. That was not even, it wasn't even, that might be me, but that is not Martin.
How did you know that? That's in my past. I thought it was forgotten.
My personal beliefs are coming out. Martin's a political columnist at the Toronto Star. He's the founder of Democracy Forum at the Toronto Metropolitan University. He was a foreign correspondent for 11 years in Asia and the Middle East, for an editor and also a parliamentary correspondent, and still one of the most important thinkers and writers that we have. He's a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and we're very grateful that he's going to lead us in discussion today. Welcome, Minister. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you. Bienvenue, bonjour. Welcome to our 36th Democracy Forum at TMU, where we try to do democracy differently. You know, at one of our earliest democracy forums, we looked at the challenge of Indigenous issues. It's the ultimate test of any democracy, or our democracy at least. So it's only natural that we would circle back to ask, what is the federal government doing about it? So let me tell you about today's guest. Gary Anandasangaree is Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations. He was previously previously parliamentary secretary to the, not a communist, as we said earlier. Inside joke if you're joining us in progress. He was previously parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice and also to the Minister of Multiculturalism, and he's been the MP for Scarborough Rouge Park since 2015. He was born in Jaffna, Sri Lanka. He studied political science at Carleton University and graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School. He had a life before politics as a human rights lawyer and community activist, which is how I first met him. You remember that? Yeah. He would work with Tamil Canadians to get their message out to the media, the big bad media. And because I had covered the civil war in Sri Lanka, we had a lot to talk about and argue about. Now the roles are reversed, because back then as an activist, he was banging down the doors to get the media to pay attention to him. Now the media are banging down doors to get access to him, but we're very grateful that you've opened the door to the Democracy Forum today. So welcome to TMU, Minister.
Thank you, Martin, and delighted to be here. Back at TMU, been here many, many times speaking to journalism students. Back then, talking about the Tamil community in the GTA and the growing pains the community went through, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s. But
I remember that.
Yeah,
and good training for a tough job that you have now. Just to get into some housekeeping first, quickly, a reminder to everyone in the audience, when you registered and when you checked in, you agreed to abide by our code of conduct, which means you get to ask questions, but you got to let the minister answer the questions too. That's how we roll in our democracy forum. There's no live microphones today. It's a small, intimate space, but we're trying to use the Slido app. We love the Slido app. It's very democratic. So you can see a QR code. Do we have it? Or Catherine, did we do Slido today? Or am I? It's coming. Oh, okay. We'll figure that part out. We have time because I will kick off the questioning, and then we'll open up to the audience. So start thinking up your questions. I like to remind people it's a democracy forum, not a news conference or a confrontation. So we try to dig a little deeper and hope for more in-depth answers from our guests. So I'm going to start with a slightly different question on land acknowledgements. Tony just delivered a lovely one right now. Some folks, First Nations folks, believe that land acknowledgements are very important. Some have had second thoughts and believe they've become kind of an empty ritual or performative. And I know you do them almost everywhere you go. Your Ontario counterpart didn't do them for a long time. What are you thinking when you deliver them? What's the good and what's the bad, maybe, about land acknowledgements?
It has become very common in most settings to do a land acknowledgement. Many times every speaker will do it. I'm increasingly of the view that if somebody's done it, then we continue the conversation. The challenge is that it's sometimes performative and a tick mark. And I think the work around reconciliation, the work around actually deeply understanding what we need to do and where we are and where we need to go, it's not a tick mark exercise. So it will require us to understand what the treaties mean, understand what the relationship we have with First Nations, Inuit, Métis. There's also, identity is complex. And we know that it evolves. We're seeing it as we speak. But the core indigeneity is a critical component of Canada and the history that is here. So I think acknowledging that is a very good starting point. It's certainly not the ending point.
Yeah.
And we need to understand deeper what we say.
Okay, one other quick housekeeping question just to set the table. There's not one of you, there's two of you who are responsible for Indigenous issues. Bit of a tag team. What's the division of labors? Just briefly, let's not get too bureaucratic. Patty Haidu is Minister of Indigenous Services. You're Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations. What's the difference?
The simplest way to explain it is Patty is about short-term, closing the gap, healthcare, education, housing, range of issues where we know that there's gaps. My work is about planting the oak trees. So it's about results we'll see in 30, 50, 100 years. It's the intergenerational impact of the work that government's going to do. Initially, they were together, coupled. Minister Bennett was the last minister who had both portfolios. And there was a deliberate attempt made to separate the roles because you can't build relationships, look at the long term, while still fighting on basic issues such as education, water, and healthcare, for example.
Okay, but you're going to have to do double duty today because you can't say ask Patty when the questions come later on. So that's two of you in cabinet, but you're down one cabinet minister this week because Randy Boissonnault resigned. And he resigned because he admitted to exaggerating his family connections to Indigenous ancestry. That's a big deal for First Nations people, for Indigenous people. There's a word for it, as you know, pretendian. Your job is to establish credibility for the Crown. This makes your job a little tougher.
Yes and no. In many ways, the work that I'm focused on is about what's called Section 35 rights holders. These are people who are in the charter in 1982 when it was repatriated. We have a Section 35, which essentially recognizes the rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights of people who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Not everyone falls into this definition, and it is one where we are also expanding this. When somebody asserts a Section 35 collectivity, we have a process to research, to get a legal opinion, and to ensure that their identity can be established or not. So if they're established as a Section 35 rights holders, then we move to the next conversation, which is about how we can draw down and establish rights for them within our Constitution and within our framework. So when we talk about Indigenous identity, it is complex, because we're talking about oftentimes people who have been displaced, people who have faced, starting up with residential schools, child welfare system, 60 scoop, modern day provincial child welfare systems, all of which has in many ways disenfranchised Indigenous people from their own communities. I know people who never thought they were Indigenous. Who grew up fully believing that they're Ukrainian, for example, and at some point realized that, look, there's something, I feel something here that's missing, and they did the research and they're finding out who they are. So it's a very difficult process, and I think the one that we're dealing with this week, I think is again, it is a result of misunderstandings, I think, of someone's identity based on what Randy believes his great-grandmother had said. And this is not to excuse the issue, but it is to really highlight it is a complicated situation, and it's not always clear-cut.
Okay, it is complicated, but it's also a political problem for you, but fair enough. Let's focus now on let's talk about Murray Sinclair, who died this month, who left a legacy as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Canadians still talk a lot about it, but just following up on the last question, it's now a question of credibility and trust, not just truth, but trust and taking action. You established a National Council of Reconciliation this summer, but we won't know its impact for a long time. You're all about the future, but you're also you're also accountable today for today. So you have described reconciliation, I think, as an ongoing journey. Writers like to use the word journey all the time too. What's the destination? Where do you see self-government in 5 or 10 or 15 years in this country, looking out far ahead?
And just want to acknowledge Senator Sinclair. His memorial took place about a week and a half ago in Winnipeg, and I went there with this real sense of loss and walked out with a real sense of optimism. And the reason for my optimism is that I do believe that we're on the right track. Like, he gave us a very important framework through the TRC 94 calls to action. It is really a foundational piece. It's not by any means the full house, but we've been able to build on that through the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, other reports that have highlighted what we need to do. Essentially, in order for us to get to the point where we can have a wholesome conversation about reconciliation with Indigenous people, we need to close the gaps. So as long as, for example, we have in the last 2 months, 9 Indigenous men and 1 Indigenous woman who died at the hands of police. And just to put that for someone from Scarborough, someone from Toronto, just take that in for a second. I don't know if everyone in this room understands or knew this happened, right? I would bet that 99% of Canadians did not know this. But this has happened here.
And it's gotten far less publicity right now, as some have argued, than it might have gotten a few years ago. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, but I think this is where I think we've always been, right, in terms of something like this. So that's happening. As long as there's disparity in education outcomes, disparity in healthcare, disparity and all of this includes systemic racism that leads to this disparity. As long as these gaps exist, the real conversation about reconciliation is hard to have. But I think once, and this is what we're trying to do, is to close those gaps, albeit in a frustratingly slower pace than I think we would all want to get to. Once we do that, what we're simultaneously trying to do, which is what I do, is planting the seeds on self-government, self-determination. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, is a monumental achievement for Canada, because actually accepting that and having that implemented within Canadian law is so important to the long-term notions of self-determination. And on many aspects of the work we do, so we have a number of self-government agreements that we've initialed this year. There's 3 treaties that we have initialed in British Columbia. There's likely 2 more within the next 3 months. We have other sectoral education, sectoral agreements with the Anishinaabe, with the Mi'kmaq, and I can rhyme off another 24 things we've done. But all of this is leading towards the notion, nothing about us without us. And Indigenous people have the right to self-determine their future, their destiny. That includes their government. UNDRIP enables and empowers Indigenous people to select their form of government, the government of their choice.
Can you paint a picture for us, though? I mean, I've been covering that for decades now, and going back to the constitutional talks about self-government, where we've made a little bit of progress, but I'm just trying to get a sense of what it would look like 10 or 20 years from now.
I think there's some very important models that are emerging, right? And we can see, some in British Columbia. British Columbia is a very good example, because there is a modern treaty process, treaty commission process with BC and Canada at the table, and it is very much a different architecture, also a different set of commitments. And the Tuasin is an example of a modern treaty which is now being implemented. So they have self-determination over land use. They have control over their government on a range of issues. They have been able to draw down the rights. What we're seeing now, like Nisga'a is another example. Tla'amin, which is the most latest modern treaty we.
But again, without going through the check boxes, is there a way to convey to all Canadians? Indigenous people know a lot more about it. But for everyone else, what would it look like?
It starts off with getting out of the Indian Act. Because right now, the system is set up where the Indian Act kind of prevails. So this will enable, self-government will enable Indigenous First Nations particularly to be able to get out of the confines of the Indian Act and to establish their forms of governing structures, including land, right? And land is one of the major things that are part of the conversation right now, and we saw it, we're seeing it with Haida in British Columbia. And those elements kind of add up, right? So child welfare is one where there's a serious conversation on devolution of child welfare from federal and provincial agencies to communities, and that's really the debate that's taking place with the Assembly of First Nations. And we have put forward $47.8 billion over 10-year period, which is transformational because it will enable nations to set up their own systems and get out of the local child welfare agency processes that we have right now.
Let's circle back to child welfare in a moment because that's controversial. We've been talking about the future. Let's talk about the past. In a way, this year, when I look at what you've been doing, you've become a minister of apologies. You've been delivering a lot of apologies. There's a list here in Ontario last month. You apologized for the Crown mismanaging funds for First Nations in the Manitoulin Island area in the 1800s, and I quote from your statement as minister, you said, the Crown failed to act honorably. Last summer, you apologized to 9 Lakota First Nations communities for long-standing injustices. And earlier this month, you said you'd be delivering an apology to the Inuit in Nunavik in northern Quebec for the killing of sled dogs about a half-century ago. When is that coming, that apology?
Tomorrow morning, I will be flying out to northern Quebec, and we'll be delivering a formal apology tomorrow evening.
So when you deliver these apologies, what's the reaction? Do people, how do Indigenous people accept the apology? and just, yeah, how does that play out?
Apologies are hollow if they're not meaningful and they don't have impact on the actual individuals who are survivors. And far too often, more and more survivors are not there when we go because of time. The dog sled slaughter, for example, took place in the 1950s and 60s. So there are very few people who are alive from that era who are directly impacted to be able to receive the apology. But we do know that their descendants are there. Their children, their grandchildren, sometimes great-grandchildren are there. And ultimately, this is about setting the record straight and to acknowledge, oftentimes people say it's about compensation. It's not about compensation. It's actually about telling the truth, acknowledging the truth so that those who have been impacted for so long know that the perpetrator or those who were silent during atrocities that took place are acknowledging that loss, are really deeply understanding what that has meant to the community in question.
So that's the apology you deliver. What do you hear when you deliver it?
Oftentimes tears, fair bit of emotion. I rarely see anger, but a sense of relief.
Okay.
And this is people who come to the actual apologies themselves, so many may not show up because it's too hurtful for them to even sit through this.
Okay, let's start, and folks, think of your questions. And there's a Slido. You can see the Slido QR code over there if you want. Don't worry, we can also just do it the old-fashioned way if you're out of position. But start thinking up your questions. I'll open it up in a few minutes. But I wanted to circle back to what you said about the child welfare question. That's controversial because National Chiefs rejected the $47 billion offer that was on the table. You can't just walk away, so how are you going to salvage this?
We need to do the right thing. We need to make sure that children are supported and children are kept at home, are kept in their communities. It is up to First Nations to decide the path forward. We have worked for many months on coming forward with both the financial means, but also the architecture to support communities. Bill C-92, which is again, very important document, enabled drawing down of rights and negotiations on child welfare. I think we have the mechanics there. Ultimately, I think we need to make sure that we have agreement on what that looks like. And just given how close it is to timelines, I don't want to presuppose, how the AFN is going to move forward on it. But I've spoken to many chiefs. I know Minister Haidu has been speaking to them as well. And I think there's a realization that we need to put children first. And I will leave it to First Nations to decide what that looks like.
So your job title, Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, and it is a tough job. So relations, the AFN turned this down. They gave you a rough ride this summer. I don't know if many people know, but you were heckled at the meeting of AFN chiefs. How's that going?
It's part of the job, right? I would be surprised if people are not angry at the federal government. We can't just walk into a space or to a community with 154 years of colonialism, with every social economic indicator that's impacting the day-to-day lives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and expect to, shake hands, kiss babies, and walk away. It doesn't work that way. We are held to account. And for me, attending AFN or many meetings is my way of ensuring that access is there. Look, some comments may seem unfair, but I would say it goes part of the role that I have, part of the role the Prime Minister deals with, I think, each and every day. It's about the accountability piece, and we will be available and accessible in many different forums to be accountable.
We had Saul Mamakwa here, an Indigenous MPP with Tanya Talaga, former Toronto Star colleague and now well-known author, Indigenous author. at the Democracy Forum a few years ago, and Saul picked up. It wasn't the first time he's done that, but he picked up the pitcher of water and he poured it into his glass, and he said, "There's people take that for granted. I have a water bottle, so I can't do that for you." And Saul does it a lot better, but he made the point that you can't do that in a lot of Indigenous reserves because of boil water advisories. And I think there were about 14 advisories in place at the time. Now, I know you're going to tell me that you've made progress because I looked at your website. I checked up. It is down. Why did it take so long? Why has it been so hard?
When we took office in 2015, one of the commitments we made as a government was that we will remove boil water advisories in every community. And the way we've implemented that is through a process of self-determination. So if you're talking about the 1980s or 1990s, if there are 150 communities that doesn't have good water systems, Canada would put out a RFP, we'll get responses.
Request for proposals.
Request for proposals. We'll get a company from Belgium who will say, we have 150 systems. They're a bit outdated, but here, we can have it for a deal. So Canada will buy it, we'll deploy it. We wouldn't have the training, we wouldn't have the capacity. In fact, in Atikokan, I was there 5 years ago.
My wife is from Atikokan, that's why he's mentioning it.
The system there, the water system there in the local First Nation community was a system that was put in the 80s from a European company. In order to get that fixed, you need to fly in somebody from Europe for 2 weeks in order to get that fixed. Yeah. What we did since taking office is saying, okay, every community that has a boil water advisory, we want you to determine what your capacity needs are. You will determine what kind of system is required, what system you want. We will help procure it, but you need to manage it and run it. So we will be supporting you at every step of the way, but ultimately it is your decision in terms of what systems and so on. So since that time, we've taken 147 boil water advisories off, and we have, I think, 31 that are still outstanding. The same question that you ask, every grade 5 classes I go to, and I do a lot of grade 5s because they have the civics course.
That's right.
The first question I actually ask them is like, where do you guys get your water from, right? And kids are perplexed because they actually, we get it from the sink, or we get it from the tap, or somebody will say we get it from a water bottle. And then this is how we start the conversation about the disparity. And look, it is a country.
I remember when I was in Sri Lanka,
yeah,
your country of birth, during the tsunami, and there was a Canadian military force.
DART team, yeah.
The DART team. What does DART stand for? I can't remember.
Disaster
relief team. And they were deployed, and they were bringing out all these amazing water purification systems in remote parts of Sri Lanka. And in Canada, we still have boil water advisories.
Yeah, and look, that is my point, right? It is not acceptable. But what I can assure everyone is that we're getting to that place where the communities will have boil water advisories lifted. But more importantly, the legislation that's before the House right now, Bill C-61, is about recognizing the right to water. And that is something that I'm very hopeful will get through Parliament, notwithstanding the challenges we may have had recently with parliamentary process. I think it's important that we recognize the human right to water, and that is happening in Bill C-61. And this is about the longer term, right? We are going to have short-term pains, and this is part of the process to get to a place where water will be a fundamental right and is accessible to each and every community on reserve and off reserve.
Yeah, and the problem predates you, in fairness, but the short term took a long time to fix, and that's what we all struggle with. Let me just ask one more question before I open it to the floor for a bit and share the time. And I wrote this out because I want to make it make sense. As an immigrant to Canada, coming from a colonized country, Sri Lanka, talk to me about how immigrants view the colonial legacy here. Some might say, well, I wasn't here then. Why am I accountable or responsible for what these guys from Scotland did 200 or 300 or 400 years ago? But you personify the Crown, and you are the face of the Crown. You are Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations. It's in your job title. So you're I know that sounds ironic, but a lot of us are, in a way, you're the face of white colonization in this country, right? And all of us are in our own way. I'm the child of immigrants. So explain our collective responsibility, whether you are old stock Canadian, first generation like me, new immigrant. How does that work?
And I've had a long time to think about this particular question. And even before I was elected, and from the time I was elected to being appointed to this role. And I go back to myself as a first generation, Tamil Canadian, came here as a refugee when I was 10 years old. And in these last 42 years, what I have been able to benefit from this country, right? Whether it's top-notch education system, to...
Well, you didn't come to TMU, though. You were at Carleton, so...
It portrayed itself as last chance use, so TMU wasn't quite up to par. But no, look, I had great education at Carleton, went on to Osgoode. The range of opportunities I had in my life, whether it's economic, whether it's access to healthcare, and we're I think all of us see what we have available in Toronto versus outside of the GTA. And all of those things led me to a deeper understanding that I am benefiting from this colonial process and this system. And all of us, to certain degrees, maybe not everyone in the same way, but all of us who are deemed to be settlers, whether it is one generation removed or 7 generations removed, are net beneficiaries of the colonial experience.
Free riders, in a way.
Exactly. So what does that entail? Does it give me a free ride to say, well, look, this happened in 1867, this happened under, McDonald or Rice, like you name the person. Or is it up to me? Is it up to me? If I care about my local Scarborough community, the Rouge National Urban Park, or the city being accessible and open to everyone, I should equally, if not more, care about the foundational pieces that build Canada, which is on the backs of Indigenous people. And that's why, for me, I was able to do some work on the UN Declaration before it was adopted. That journey really gave me a sense of a major gap that exists, that continuously oppresses and in many ways keeps Indigenous people down, where the potential we know is there. And all it requires is for Canada to turn the page, look at this from a very decolonized perspective. And of course, it won't be easy. We have some really good goalposts, but it is about making that commitment to long-term intergenerational change where every successive government hereafter follows this path. And it doesn't matter what stripe, it doesn't matter what color of the party, there is no choice. This is a one-way street towards this path, and I think that we need to have sustained efforts. This is where all Canadians, I think, need to come on board and understand that this is our collective journey.
I'm going to open it to questions now. I'm going to just apologize in advance. If you see me sometimes looking at my phone while you're talking, I'm just multitasking. I'm not surfing WhatsApp. I'm actually looking at your questions. And this is a sensitive point for the minister because one of the reasons he was heckled at the Assembly of First Nations meeting is that he was looking at his phone. And what were you looking at?
Which actually what I did was not looking at the phone. It was corrected. That news article was corrected.
Why, but someone said you're looking at your phone, or
there was a claim that was made. Yeah,
okay,
yeah. Which is.
So don't heckle me if I'm looking at my phone.
Needless to say, I don't keep my phone out when I'm doing these anymore. I keep it inside.
Yeah, I just use mine as a timer, but Slido is getting me in trouble for looking at my phone. Okay, question from Jerry. Has the most votes. What concrete opportunities is your ministry creating for students, including students at TMU, to actively participate in reconciliation efforts? So how do people here or on campus get involved in reconciliation?
It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer because ultimately the work that we do as a federal government is very much with Indigenous people directly. In terms of locally, I think one of the major things that we are encouraging special provinces is to ensure that the education system reflects the experience of Indigenous people. And I'll give you a couple of concrete examples where I think we've seen progress. Grade 5s are always my benchmark, right? Because grade 5s, so I go to grade 5 classes since 2016, and I see the conversation shift. The conversation, from how many people know about residential schools, you'll have 2-3 people put up their hand now. That's not even a question I ask, because it's much beyond that. It's about, what are the impacts? How about child welfare? How about a range of issues that I think people have, especially young people, have understood, primarily because of what educators have done. And we're seeing that with grade 11 Indigenous literature course that's in some schools, not all, but it is an optional credit. And I've spoken to a couple of the classes. It's a very deep, much deeper understanding. And we know that's translating into the university sector as well. So there are, law schools. I'm very familiar with law programs. Virtually every law school has an element of foundational Indigenous learning. I know Windsor has a program. Ottawa U has a 1-week.
Don't forget the
preliminary.
TMU Law School, the Lincoln Alexander Law.
I'm just getting there. I'm just getting to.
It should be top of the list.
Of course, right? And we're seeing that. And I think those are. We never had that when I was in law school. Like, that wasn't even a conversation. It was an optional course with like 3 students usually, and an instructor who had some indirect knowledge of Indigenous law. Now we have the likes of like John Burrows, who's teaching at U of T Law, who's a leading expert, and we have so many other academics within law schools. Just as an example, I have a law school bias, so I'll just highlight that. But we're seeing that. We're seeing that with, I was at McMaster Medical Center and spoke to the Indigenous Health unit and the work that they're doing to make sure that the doctors that are coming out are not just increased levels of Indigenous doctors and other health professionals, but also there's a much deeper understanding of what, the learning around traditional medicine and how that can be incorporated into their work.
Let me just jump in with 2 quick follow-ups, and we'll go back to the audience. And that is, one, lawyers are important. So you mentioned you have that law school bias, but so much of the progress and lack of progress on Indigenous issues is because it has become it's so litigious. It's more litigation over legislation and negotiation. And in a way, when you see so many treaty rights being referred by the courts, it's because the politicians and the Indigenous leaders couldn't reach a deal at the table. So isn't that a failure on the part of the politicians when the lawyers are doing it instead of the politicians?
So we have a 2017 directive where Minister of Justice at the time, with the support of cabinet said we're looking at options to off-ramp many of the litigation. And if you look at many of the settlements that we've had, they're in the process, there is a legal process, but doesn't go the distance. There's not legal renderings that force us to do certain things. In some cases they do, but in many it is about resolution out of the courts. The Robinson-Huron Treaty annuity claim is probably the best example of that. Province of Ontario in Canada resolved with the Robinson-Huron 21 members a resolution of $10 billion. That happened at the table. And increasingly, that's what we're trying to do. So we are, as a department, we have the highest level of contingent liability, and virtually every single thing that comes before us, we're looking to see if it is appropriate to be at the table to resolve.
Second quick follow-up is you mentioned the history courses in Ontario. When the Doug Ford government took power in 2018, they kind of slow-walked. The Kathleen Wynne government had tried to move quickly on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Judge Sinclair, but the Ford government tried to slow it down. What are relations like between you and your counterpart in Ontario, and in terms of policing, in terms of healthcare, and in terms of trying to instill history in our schools?
Well, I have an excellent relationship with Minister Rickford. He is a counterpart. We meet regularly, and there's a number of very important things that we're working on, including the resolution of the Robinson Huron. We are now in negotiations on the Robinson Superior. Look, with every province, Canada is such a complex country with territories and provinces. I will say that British Columbia, we've had the best relationship, just given alignment on UNDRIP and a range of other treaties that we've been able to conclude. Manitoba is an excellent partner. Ontario is a good partner, and we don't always agree on everything, but we're certainly, I think we are in the same mindset, or at least similar mindset, to be able to advance reconciliation.
Okay. Question from, forgive my pronunciation, Kaumitha. Kimberly Murray's report on the unmarked graves was recently released. What are your initial impressions, and what do you plan on doing in response?
The special interlocutor, Kimberly Murray, she was tasked by the former Minister of Justice, and I was at that time there at the announcement. I was the Parliamentary Secretary to Justice, tasked to advise the government on what the next steps towards unmarked graves. She came back about 2 weeks ago with a pretty comprehensive set of demands that we should follow. I think there are 42 of them in total, and they range from going to the UN for additional investigation, enabling legislation that will recognize residential school denialism as under the criminal code, and a range of other measures. They're comprehensive in nature, and the Minister of Justice is looking at how to respond. I think we are trying to understand the enormity of the task ahead, and I think we will have a formal response in due course. We're not going to rush this. We want to understand what the scope and the extent of the work that's involved, and I will work with Mr. Varani to get to that place. It is crucially important that the work around unmarked graves is one where the TRC concluded the work with some question marks, some gaps that they themselves recognized, and the work we've done since that time to Kamloops, for example, where it was really animated, and there's a cross-Canada conversation about unmarked graves, I think is posing new questions. Okay, there are unmarked graves, there's anomalies found, and if a community wants to do a deeper search, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Right? What are the, how do you find truth in that? How do you find or seek accountability? What does accountability look like? Do we even have the laws to ensure that those measures of accountability can take place? Are people still around? How do you identify and return, if appropriate, that's what the community wants, the actual children themselves? So there's hundreds of questions, I think, that needs to be answered, and that can only come from a comprehensive approach to how we address this.
Okay. A question from Francis, a bit of a follow-up to the earlier question, but a little more specific. In what ways can Indigenous languages and systems of education be introduced into post-secondary institutions like Toronto Met to best represent Indigenous students and their interests? Great
question. Look, I think so we were part of developing C91, which is the Indigenous Languages Act. And we did a lot of consultation, and I was the Parliamentary Secretary to Heritage when we did that. So we did a lot of consultations across Canada on languages. How do we protect languages? How do we ensure, according to UNESCO, 75% of Indigenous languages will die within a generation.
Do you speak any? What foreign languages do you speak, if any?
I speak Tamil.
Tamil? No French?
No, limited French.
Do you feel yourself losing your Tamil?
No, but I feel my kids losing that.
Use it or lose it. Keep going. So Indigenous languages.
So this is where there's real conversation about what the role of universities are. And it's a complex issue because oftentimes universities have been known to have benefited from funding, whether it's national funding or provincial funding, towards, and it's important funding, it's important work that they do, but the recognition was that if the federal government is funding, it should be funding at the local community level so that languages could be preserved locally and not be at, Young and Dundas, for example, as opposed to, in community in Atikokan or other places.
There's another question I wanted to follow up on here. I asked you earlier about litigation versus negotiation, and this question has reminded me to sort of follow up on that, and which is the Canadian, this is an anonymous questioner, is the Canadian Settler Society still not ready to deal with the Indigenous question, or is the issue more on the government side? And I guess I would add to that, are the negotiators, are the politicians reluctant to go the extra mile because they're afraid that the people who elected them won't support it? So where is the resistance or the inertia? Is it with politicians who always get the blame, or is it because you feel you don't have enough support among voters? And if that's the case, do you as leaders need to energize and educate Canadians more to make those expensive compromises?
I think there is leadership, like from a government perspective. I'll look at, stay away from the feds, for example. Let's look at the province of British Columbia. Under Premier Horgan, under the current Premier Abbey, they have moved mountains on reconciliation. They have invested heavily. They have implemented UNDRIP. They are looking at reconciliation in a very different way than any previous provincial government.
Okay, so have they encountered resistance or a reaction from
I think,
voters?
And this is what I'm getting to, is if you look at what happened in the last election, they did not have that support and the resounding, overwhelming acknowledgement of the work that happened, right? So I think in that case, the province was not with them. I do think they're very strong in terms of moving forward, and they will show leadership. But I think there's a gap, and I think if you take this in the Canadian context, what we have done as a government is very significant, and we have, at the very minimum, we have changed the tide. We have moving towards consistent, long-term, predictable funding, and we have implemented a range of issues that cannot be reversed.
But from what I'm hearing, sorry to interrupt, but what I'm hearing is that there's not just a leadership gap, but a persuasion gap, and that and as politicians, you may want to make the other side happy and do the right thing, but if you get too far out ahead of the people who put you in power, you may lose power.
Well, exactly. So this is where Canadians need to come along, right? And Canadians, I don't think generally have gone into community. I don't think they understand that there's broader issues of, say, water and some things that may seem, very tangible. But until people go into community and understand, okay, what is the loss of language to that community? What is the loss of, dogs to Inuit communities in the north who use that as a primary form of transportation? I think unless they see that, they don't understand the urgency. And I think once they do, then that's when I think that urgency will come about. And I feel like, we are on track to make these significant changes, but we still have a long, long way to go.
Here's a question that one of my Indigenous colleagues at the Star asked me to ask. There's an epidemic of suicides in reserves, and we talk about it more than ever at the national level, but across Canada, suicides are actually tracking down, but in Indigenous areas, they're still going up. So it's only getting worse. What can you do in a concrete way? One of the challenges, obviously, just like mental health is now discussed openly on campus, it almost always comes up at a democracy forum. The challenge on reserve is getting health professionals and first responders, or not first responders, but frontline is what I meant, health professionals, sometimes into remote areas. So how do you fix this?
There are a number of issues. I think the actual service providers is one aspect. Access to basic supports, when somebody faces trauma is lacking. But the more, I think, foundational pieces are employment, housing, the social determinants that will enable individuals to have agency over their life and control over, their future. A lot of those elements are missing, and this is the gap that I spoke about at the beginning. So
that's because you're minister of the future. But what about your colleague, the minister of today?
Well, but this is what I'm talking about. Like that, we are trying to close the gap, right? But and of course we can, we have significant funding towards mental health, addictions, and so on. But it is not something that we have figured out as a society, right? And especially when we're dealing with intergenerational trauma as a result of a range of issues, including residential schools, we know that is very, very hard to address. One of the things that we are, I think, making progress on is we know that when there's better connection to language and culture and ways of life, we know that there's change that happens in people. So I was in Northwest Territories about a week ago, and I was at the school, and the Grand Chief told me that they now have a in the land program for young people who are now out of the school. So they have 5 young people they take to the land, they're hunting, they're spending time outside since I think September now, almost 2.5 months, and they're seeing tangible changes in individuals. So a lot of the holistic healing and traditional ways of life, reintroducing that, I think, are critical elements. But we're not fully there yet. I think we have programs that speak to this and support these initiatives, but not in a comprehensive way that that can impact everyone. And of course, there is no one-size-fits-all model. It is about individual nations again, figuring out what that looks like for them and experimenting and seeing if that's working.
If there's anyone here who hasn't figured out Slido and wants to ask, go ahead, jump in.
It's okay. I'm Allison. I'm a federal public servant. I work right around the corner. And I've heard in the conversation a couple of times the idea that first we have to close the socioeconomic gaps, and then we can progress self-determination, right? But I've read plenty of research that says that's upside down and backwards, and that communities that have greater self-determination have a greater ability to improve their socioeconomic outcomes.
Let me just maybe clarify.
Federal Public Service keeping you honest here, Minister.
Excellent. Let me just clarify that, right? So what I'm not suggesting that we wait for one or the other, right? They both have to happen together. All I'm saying is while the gaps continue and persist, we cannot look at the much longer term notions of reconciliation, right? And that doesn't mean that we don't do the work. We are doing the work right now, and that's why I oftentimes use the term, planting oak trees, because it is about making sure that while we're closing the gap, we're still ensuring that there's self-determination, because you're right, it does, we do know that, and the perfect example would be the Mi'kmaq sectoral education agreement in Nova Scotia, where they've had self-determination over education for over 30 years now, and their provincial outcomes in education are higher than the provincial averages. And we just renewed that for 3,000 students in Nova Scotia. So you're right, it is about self-determination, and that's why I continuously talk about self-determination, self-government, because it is about giving control. They never gave up control, but reinstating control over every element of people's lives back to Indigenous people.
I want to just jump to a question that's in the news that I've been wanting to ask, and that is policing problems from both angles. A lot of people, as you mentioned earlier, very concerned about the problem of poor policing on reserves and needless deaths due to mental health crises that are not with lousy interventions. But the other day, some Indigenous chiefs spoke up to the media about the crime and crisis on reserve. We all talk all the time in our big cities about crime, addiction, and the lack of policing. What about in Indigenous communities? I mean, they deserve protection too, and some of them are overwhelmed. So how do you deal with that tension between, on the one hand, a concern sometimes in the big cities that Indigenous policing is not done properly, and then the concern from Indigenous chiefs in some cases, in remote reserves, where things are spiraling downwards, that we don't have enough policing, enough good policing.
I think ultimately the question around policing is about, back to the notion of self-determination. It's about having direct control over policing in community, because we know one of the work that I do is around missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals. And one of the major pushback we get, because we're trying to implement a red dress alert system, so people have to file a complaint and then this alert goes off, and we were able to find people who go missing when the local community knows within a very short period of time. But there's distrust in people going to the police and making a complaint because the history hasn't been positive, and I alluded to that earlier. So ultimately it's about ensuring that policing in community is by the community with community oversight, as opposed to a national, like provincial or a national police service that there's a complex web of authorities, as opposed to the local community having that self-determination. And that's really what we want to get to. Minister LeBlanc is working on that. We are still far off from legislation, but ultimately it's about, for example, go back to Atikokan. I think you and I need to go to Atikokan together.
Together with my wife, yes.
Going back to the community and saying, what does policing look like for you? Like, what are and what authorities do you need to be able to enforce the laws that you have, not just Canadian or Ontario law, but what are the local things that you want to enforce that can be codified or that can be somehow brought within a legal structure that'll enable you to enforce.
I'm going to give you the last question because you've got me, you're in my line of sight, so I can't turn you down.
Okay. So you have mentioned that you're always for self-determination and self-governance, and as the Minister of the Future in some sense, my question is based on what I've read in scholarships about the idea of land back, giving the land, Crown land back to Indigenous sovereignty, giving back their resources, and having more of a nation-to-nation relationship. So I'm wondering, what is kind of like the Crown or like the government's perspective of giving back more of the land back to Indigenous sovereignty?
I think that's a great way to probably conclude.
I have one more question for you after that. You're not off the hook.
It's hugely important, right? Because ultimately, the land is sacred, and the land is where people have lived for thousands of years. And when I talk about some of the modern treaties in British Columbia, the Tla'amin, the Tuasin, the three that we initialed this year, Kitsim-Kalim, Kitsalis, and Comox, they all involve land back to the nation. And it does enable economic prosperity, economic development, but also responsible development, right? Because they ultimately control what can happen in their land. And I believe that is the future. That is where we're going. And I will have some very exciting news in the next, hopefully 6 to 8 weeks, where we are doing something historical that will demonstrate how we're going to move forward. But there are some very concrete examples of land being returned, land being enshrined into some of the modern treaties. But I think you nailed it, as in the foundational piece that we need towards a renewed nation-to-nation relationship.
You are the Minister of Future, but you don't have to wait. The future is now. You can announce it right now if you want.
Once I get the authorities, yes.
I have one last question, and that is, as I said, when I met you, you were an activist on the outside. Now you're on the inside, and you're the face of the Crown, which is a tough job, but someone's got to do it. Any advice for students who might be watching on campus about getting involved in politics as you ultimately did? Any regrets? Any inspiration that you can share despite the tough questions you often take?
I'm going to call out Dave there because he's a good friend of mine, but someone who actually has inspired me a great deal on the work around policing and community engagement. There are so many people I think are at TMU and in your classes when you when you do the work of activism, there's nothing that's too small, right? It oftentimes starts on your street, on your neighborhood. It could be the best civil rights story I have in Canada, or one of the best ones in my neighborhood, is about the Rouge National Urban Park. Mm-hmm. So you'll know that the city, as it sprawled, there was a huge amount of development that was taking place, especially in eastern Toronto, in Scarborough and Pickering. And the citizens movement, started off with a woman called Lois James. Unassuming, I think she was a teacher, and a few young people in the 80s who said, well, we just can't have this developments taking place, and there's this beautiful historic important river system called the Rouge River, and we need to protect this area. There's so many different ecological spaces there that are so important to us. It's the tail end of the Carolinian forest system, so we just can't have development there. And they stopped development. They actually stood in front of a bulldozer and said, you're not going to build more homes, or you're not going to build more developments in our Rouge. Fast forward, 40 years later, we now have the Rouge National Urban Park, 79.1 square kilometers. As of last week, it's now 80 square kilometers of land, which hopefully will become co-managed by Indigenous people. And that is, to me, the power of that one individual. So all of us have that power, and we don't need to be in office to do that. We can do it, with a pen, or typewriter now, or computer. Phone. Or voice, I guess. We could do it by door knocking, we could do it by standing in front of a bulldozer, although I don't recommend that. But all of this is what makes democracy function and work.
Which is more satisfying, blocking the bulldozer or driving the bulldozer? Power or out of power?
Having watched the Gardner being blocked at a certain point in our history, and being on the other side, I think they're all empowering moments, and you can't have one without the other. And it is so critical that I think we have people in every space, and again, lawyers are critically important. Journalists are so important, because journalists tell the truth, or attempt to tell the truth, especially in a world where we know that's becoming a scarce commodity. Politicians, many do, just work away. Like John McKay, I talk about, he's my colleague from Scarborough-Guildwood, almost 27 years in office. He comes to work as though it's his first day. Just recently, he passed a bill on anti-slavery, on supply chains, right? So there's so much work that every one of us do. The titles are they're interchangeable and they're temporary. But I think our commitment towards a better world, social justice, one that is rooted on reconciliation, I think it's a far more enduring legacy for all of us.
I still think you have a tough title, Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, to be the face of the Crown. That's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank the Minister for coming today to the Democracy Forum. Thanks to the audience for being so democratic. A special shout out to the team at the Dais that supports the Democracy Forum. Merci, Megwech. Thank you.
Thank you.